about all kinds of stuff. Professor Dave explains.
During the Bronze Age, which began around 5,300 years ago and ended around 3,150 years ago, there were two interlinked civilizations that flourished in the eastern Mediterranean, specifically in Greece and the islands nearby. Unlike the Greeks of the later classical era, who made such a great impression on human civilization that they and their culture were never entirely forgotten, these two civilizations, the Minoans on the island of Crete and the Mycenaeans on the Greek mainland, are known to us primarily from the physical remains they left behind, though there is one other interesting source of information we will get to shortly. Let's start with the Minoans. Their civilization dominated Crete between 3500 and 1200 BCE. It's divided by archaeologists into a few periods based on the development of the huge palaces that, like medieval estates, were at the center of their cities. The most famous of these was Knossos, which had the largest palace and has produced the richest finds. These palaces were built with sophisticated architectural techniques and had a form of indoor plumbing. They were self-contained communities with workshops, storerooms, treasuries, and open spaces where rituals and dances were performed. These rituals often had to do with bulls. Based on the art found painted on walls in Knossos, leaping over a running bull was a central part of Minoan ritual, and it could have been a rite of initiation. There is a memory of this in the later Greek myth of the Minotaur, the bull that the Cretan king Minos kept in his labyrinth. The Minoans had an elaborate trading network, maintaining economic relationships with the Greek mainland to the north, Egypt to the southeast, as well as Cyprus and the coast of Palestine to the east. Art and objects from Crete have been found in Egypt and vice versa, and their particular tastes influenced the way utensils and art were being made in Greece at the time. They also had their own writing system, which is now called Linear A, but like other early systems of writing, it was not very easy to learn, though certainly easier than cuneiform, and they used it mainly to keep track of things like sales and inventory. One of the great mysteries about the Minoans is what kind of language they spoke. Because no one else used their alphabet, we don't have any way to link its characters to specific sounds. One of the more striking things about Minoan cities is how often they had to rebuild them. They suffered at least two major earthquakes in the 17th and 15th centuries BCE, and each time they reconstructed their cities and palaces. Furthermore, in the 1600s BCE, an enormous volcanic eruption on an island north of Crete damaged its outlying settlements and may have caused a tsunami that washed away towns on the coast of Crete itself. In the end, it may have been other people that dealt the Minoans their final blow. Around 1450 BCE, the palaces were destroyed for the last time, and it's then that we see signs of Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland to the north living in Cretan cities. We know they were there because they had a system of their own for writing Greek, which they based on the Minoan system, but the evidence isn't conclusive that it was the Mycenaeans who destroyed the Minoans' palaces. It's more likely that they encountered yet another natural disaster, which the Mycenaeans then took advantage of. It says something about the attractions of Minoan culture that we find the same kinds of art and artifacts even after the Mycenaeans had settled in Crete, but there are signs that they had a more militaristic culture than the Minoans did. Their art featured scenes of battle, and they were buried together with their weapons. Even before the Greeks conquered Crete, they had their own settlements on the mainland, of which Mycenae was the largest. These go back as far as the 17th century BCE. During this period, as in later centuries, Greece was not a single kingdom or state, but only a loose group of independent city-states that traded and fought with one another. As with the Minoans, what we know of them comes mainly from archaeology, but the memory of these cities and their kings and warriors, which had faded with age, formed the basis of the story of the Trojan War, told by Homer in the Iliad about 300 years after the end of the Mycenaean civilization. Like the Minoans, the Mycenaeans traded with the other peoples of the eastern Mediterranean. They imported precious metals like gold, copper, and tin for making bronze, and they exported agricultural products like wool, olive oil, and wine. We know where they sent products like oil and wine because they were shipped in clay jars, which may break but will otherwise survive in the ground for thousands of years. A number of Mycenaean cities are mentioned in Egyptian records starting in the 15th century BCE, but because Egyptian and Greek were so different, their names can be hard to interpret. The Mycenaeans also took after the Minoans in building large palaces that were centers of administration. Each city had a king, called a wanax, a word Homer still used to describe kings like Agamemnon. The palaces controlled the territories that surrounded them, including the farmers and workmen who lived there, and they seem to have been at the center of a stratified society made up of the court, an elite class, and the demos, or people. As we saw in Crete, Mycenaean life and culture was more interested in battle than the Minoans had been. Their palaces were surrounded by thick walls and placed on heights for defensive purposes. They left lots of weapons and pictures of combat, and the subjects of rulers were expected to serve them in battle. This is also hinted at in the Iliad, where the fighters who come to Troy are personally loyal to their kings. Aside from Homer, we know a fair amount about Mycenaean society from their own writings. These were lists and inventories rather than literature or history, but they do refer to some of the Mycenaeans' officials, occupations, and institutions, and the gods they worshipped. The Mycenaeans used the Linear B script to write a form of the Greek we know from later centuries, but it was entirely different from the classical Greek alphabet and could only approximate the sounds of spoken Greek. We also know something about their religious life from their wall paintings, which show the same kind of bull leaping we find on Crete, as well as ceremonial processions which include both men and women. This brings us to the most famous question ever asked about the Mycenaeans. Did they actually sail to Troy, as Homer says? While the site of the ancient city of Troy, including evidence of its destruction on more than one occasion, was discovered in the 19th century, there is no way to know for sure who destroyed it, and though the man who found Troy, Heinrich von Schliemann, was convinced he had proven that Homer was accurate, he was something of a huckster who was not afraid to make things up when it suited his purposes. On the other hand, the records of the Hittite Empire, which was based in Asia Minor, where Troy was located, mention people to the west called the Ahiyawa, with whom they fought around 1250 BCE, when the Ahiyawan king supported a rebellion against the empire, which included the city of Wilusa. If the Ahiyawa were the Achaeans, as Homer sometimes calls the Greeks, and Wilusa was Ilion, the Greek name for Troy, then these records could be evidence of the battle that inspired the Iliad. The Bronze Age civilizations of both Crete and Greece came to a fairly sudden end. Around 1250 BCE, several Mycenaean cities were destroyed or damaged, and around 1190, many more were totally abandoned. This would be noteworthy enough in itself, but it happened at a time when the Hittite Empire and other states were also heavily damaged. It also coincides with an attack on Egypt, which is described in its records as an invasion of sea peoples. The Assyrian Empire in Mesopotamia also suffered some setbacks around that time. The question then is whether and how all of these events, which are now collectively called the Bronze Age collapse, might have been connected, and again we are hampered by a lack of written records from that time. As for the Mycenaeans, there is some question as to whether they were as much the perpetrators as the victims of what happened, because the Egyptians mentioned among the sea peoples a group they called the Ekwesh, who may have been identical with the Achaeans. There was also a later myth about another Greek tribe called the Dorians, who invaded from the north around this time, but the archaeological evidence isn't conclusive. In fact, there are scholars who think that it was a natural disaster, like drought or earthquake, that caused the Mycenaeans to abandon their cities. Another theory is that there were uprisings among the subjects of the local kings. The end of the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations ushered in a period of around 300 years, now known as the Greek Dark Age, because there were no cities, not a lot of trade, and no literature or even writing that we know of. It was only after this period that the society we call Classical Greece began to emerge. Let's move forward and see what this classical period was all about.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.